we, for the first time in human history, have a very clear understanding of how it is that we can be organized in a way that is decentralized yet still cooperative.
Today, I'm delighted to be welcoming Peter Ludlow in conversation with Jarrad Hope on network state. Before we get into some detailed questions and talk about network state and a whole variety of topics, I was just wondering if, Peter, if you could tell us a bit more about yourself. You've been an inspiration to many of us within our space, but also broadly throughout the years. You're a well-known author, you're a well-known philosopher, and an intellectual. So I just wanted to, for you, if that's okay, in your own words, tell us a bit more about yourself, your intellectual journey, and your development throughout the years.
Well, let's see. Many, many years ago, I got my PhD in philosophy. That would have been around 1985. And then my first job out from there was actually in the artificial intelligence area, specifically the Intelligent Interface Systems Group at Honeywell back in the day. So this is kind of OG artificial intelligence. And then at some point in the mid 90s, I got involved with certain foundational issues involving the internet. And I had a collection of papers that I edited called High Noon on the Electronic Frontier. And then in the late 90s, I got interested in issues involving cryptography and how one might use cryptography to create little islands in the network and create little sovereign states, as it were. And so towards the end of the 20th century, I guess the book came out in 2001, but it was assembled a little bit earlier. I published a collection with MIT Press called Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, and Pirate Utopias, in which I explored the possibility of online network states, if you will, or cyberstates, as I called them, that could exist outside of the purview of traditional nation states and the internet. And I've done other things since then in different areas, but I think that's the reason we're here today.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for me, it's a huge honor to speak with you and to work with you. I became aware of the book probably when I was around 13 or 14 years old, Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, Pirate Utopias. And I came to it through the tail end of Muds and Moos, and I was using precursors to, I guess, what people call the metaverse these days, particularly a 3D chat program called Active Worlds. And I saw that, inside these worlds, you started to have these governance issues. At the same time, I was also got into anarchy and libertarianism and agorism at the time. So it was the sort of perfect blend of the ideas that I was already discovering myself. But I was really curious to hear what was your perspective at that time, and why were people thinking this, and yeah.
Well, I mean, there weren't very many people thinking this at all. I mean, there were basically the cypherpunks, so people like Timothy May and so forth, and then a little bit later, about that time, you had the essay by the Declaration of the Independence of Cyberspace. And that was inspirational for some people as well. But I think for me, the kind of big inspiration were the cypherpunks, and in particular, Tim May's thing, which was called a Crypto Anarchy Manifesto, I believe it was called. And he sort of, in a very short kind of 2-page manifesto, he kind of spelled out some of these ideas. And I just went and surfed the internet and dug up as much as I could, but it was a finite amount of information at that time. I mean, there were 10, 15, 20 essays that were exploring these topics, and some of it was academic and some of it was just people doing rants and manifestos on the internet. So I assembled those and then created a kind of arc tying them together and trying to articulate some sort of theme that was emerging from those ideas that were percolating at the time. But Jarrad, I have a question for you. So you were like 13 or 14 years old at the time when you came across the collection. Yeah, and so how did you find it? I'm curious.
I like, as I said to Stella Assange in a previous podcast, right? I became like aware of Julian Assange through the allegations of him penetrating Milnet and his hacker group, the International Subversives. And at the time, they were publishing tips and tricks on various hacking and phreaking. And like phreaking was kind of like my first foray, even though I was already into the sort of hacking scene.
Phreaking
right?
meaning phone phreaking, yeah? Where you the old analog telephone system or something.
Exactly. And like my father used to work for Telcom, which
nice.
was the national telecommunications provider in Australia.
Right.
So I naturally had an inclination towards that and like would build beige boxes. I managed to get like a bunch of codes, go into the ABX systems and these sort of things. But that kind of introduced me into the sort of cypherpunk scene.
Okay,
right?
so if I can ask you questions here too. Sir, I don't mean to take the moderator role, but I'm fascinated by this. So when you say a beige box, that's like I'm familiar with blue boxes, which a blue box was a thing, as I recall, that made a tone that would replicate the noise that was made when you dropped a quarter in an old phone. And so what's a beige box then?
A beige box was basically just like a headset that had like these wires or like alligator clips attached to it, right?
Okay.
And so you could get into these like pits and literally just clip on both sides onto a telephone wire, and you would have instant access to any kind of communication that's running over it. So then you could like run your modem over that and be using someone else's phone line effectively.
Okay. So, I mean, this is like, I'm really fascinated by this too. And again, I don't mean to take moderator's role here, but there is a history of like guys that came out of the phone phreaking thing. I guess the most famous examples are like Steve Jobs and Wozniak, right? Didn't they start out as phone phreakers?
I'm not actually entirely sure on that. No,
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised.
Yeah. And then one last question, and then I'll let us get back on track. So you are a fellow Australian with Assange then. So did you know of Assange before he became an international thing?
No, I mean, yes and no. Like, I think it kind of coincided, right? So we were both on opposite ends of Australia, and it's a very sparsely populated place.
Yeah.
Having that said, and like the internet was also very different then. But I think it was through the news that I started to become more aware of him, particularly around Milnet. And then I basically followed him since.
Okay. And I promised I wasn't going to ask any more questions, but I have one more. So when you got you were like 13, 14 years old, and you got a copy of Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, and Pirate Utopias, like in a library or a bookstore.
Exactly. So I found it in a library, in a local library initially. Yeah, and then I got my own copy eventually.
And you were living at home at the time, or you were out?
So it kind of happened. I was reading it during a transitionary period, right? So I ended up leaving home relatively early and living on a park bench, and kind of only had $20 and a pair of clothes to my name.
Right.
So yeah, and then like at that point, it was very much like survival mode, trying to figure out how to make money, and like I was very good with computers, so like I naturally did like webmastering, or I guess like you call it web application development these days, that sort of thing, as well as media design. But was also very interested in like understanding systems and exploiting them, and
very cool.
Figuring out how they work.
Very cool.
The other side of that is, I guess, partially the reason why like anarchy was something that was appealing to me, or which kind of evolved into libertarianism as moved on from there, was largely seeing like authority positions that had what I would consider to be incompetence, right? And I felt like that was an abuse of authority, and I didn't take very well to that, as well as, the circumstances of being transitioning out of home, I guess.
Right. But
yeah.
I have to say, I have this mental image of this 14-year-old kid sitting on a park bench with a dog-eared copy of Crypto Anarchy, Cyberstates, and Pirate Utopias. That's
yeah, I would say that's a pretty accurate description. Yeah.
That's amazing. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Al, I return the moderation to you.
Fantastic. No.
But I mean, I guess, like,
go ahead, Jarrad.
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of curious, like, why was Crypto Anarchy interesting to you? Like, why did you get drawn to that and then write a book about that?
So it's kind of a vague memory of how all this went down. But the deal was, I had been working in the computer industry, and then I got a job in a philosophy department. And at some point, we had a very paranoid dean of humanities, and someone had leaked one of his memos. It was someone in the women's studies department, but he decided that it must be me. And so he passed around this memo about the electronic intruder that had somehow hacked in. He decided that because I knew about computers, I must have hacked into the university email system or something like that. Because this was, say, early 90s, 90, 91, something like that. And at the time, if you knew anything about computers at all, you must be a hacker. I mean, so yeah. we see paranoia about technology today. At the time, it was through the roof. I mean, anything, the way people talk about crypto now, or the way people talk about Bitcoin now, that's how they talked about the internet, period, And so I became sort of fascinated by the psychology of people that would act this way and act against people in this way. And so I became interested, and I actually met a bunch of early hackers like Fiber Optic and those guys. And there was a guy who made some tabletop games, role-playing games. It was called Steve Jackson Games, and he had one called Cypherpunk. And, he had been raided by the Secret Service because of his tabletop game. And so there was a kind of collection of these people who had been victimized by paranoia about technology that we got together in the Well, which was an early electronic bulletin board, where the Well stood for Whole Earth Electronic Link. And at the time, so there were some early hackers in there, and then John Perry Barlow, Mitch Kapor. This was about the time they started the Electronic Frontier Foundation. And so I became one of the donators to the Electronic Frontier Foundation. Mike Godwin hadn't even started working for them at the time. He was just on the Well spouting stuff about the law. He ended up writing the foreword to my first collection, the one High Noon on the Electronic Frontier. So I met all of these people, and then I just got engaged with it and things the government was doing against people that were interested in technology, cryptography, and that's how I became familiar with the cypherpunks and various ideas involving crypto in general.
And I mean, like the book is like a play on like Robert Nozick's defense of libertarianism, right?
Yeah.
Like Anarchy State Utopia.
Exactly.
Like, yeah. How do you compare and contrast, or is there a comparison at all?
Well, I mean, it does touch on anarchy. It does touch on state, and it does touch on utopia. And at the time, I was interested in where this was going to go, and would it lead to some form of anarchy or anarchical organization? If I know that sounds inconsistent, like an oxymoron, but actually it's not, right? It's just because anarchy just means without a head, and so you could still organize, right? Um, and then utopia, and what I was interested in, well, could these virtual states, if and when they emerge, could they foster certain kinds of utopian visions? And so I looked at people that thought yes and people that thought hell no. And then I ended up with a kind of view which was on the margins, where I took the idea from Hakim Bey and his temporary autonomous zone and said, well, you're going to get these little temporary utopias, but they're going to get smushed out. So at the time, there was a kind of pessimism in my thinking about what we now call network states or cyber states. And I thought that they would emerge, but that the powers that be would squash them. And I'm not that pessimistic anymore. Now I think they actually have staying power. And I think they're somewhat inevitable. And in fact, I think they will outlast the powers that currently be.
Okay, well, I mean, there's certainly lots to unpack there and get into, right?
Yeah.
So you kind of, alluded to like, then and now. I guess like I'd be very curious to hear a bit more like how your thinking has changed and why you've gone from this sort of pessimism to this maybe optimism or cautiously optimistic.
Well, I think the key thing, you have to remember that when I assembled the material, it was in the late 90s and it was published in 2001, I believe. I mean, it was all pre-Satoshi, right? And so there were ideas about digital currency in there, but this was if you remember David Chaum, when he was one of the pioneers of digital currency. And so there was always a thought, well, we're going to get digital currencies, et cetera, et cetera. But it was Satoshi that really showed us how we can be coordinated. So the way I think of it is it's not merely decentralized, but it's decentralized yet coordinated, right? So that Bitcoin, for example, is completely decentralized or nearly completely decentralized, but there's a kind of coordination mechanism that underlies the whole thing. And so then once you have that idea, then you can suddenly become a lot more optimistic about what can be accomplished with cyberstates, that you can actually be organized, even though you are somewhat anarchical, right? That is, you don't have centralized authorities running the show. You can actually have coordinated human action without a single centralized authority, or without having even well, we could actually talk about this, but I was going to say oligarchy, but I know you've been thinking about that lately. So, but then the basic idea is, now Satoshi really showed us that we can organize ourselves, we can have organized systems, even though we don't have any sort of centralized mechanism running the show. And to me, let me just add here that this is the big thing about Satoshi's white paper. Everyone thinks that, well, what is crypto about? It's about a new financial order. We're talking about a new asset class, or we're talking about a new currency, or we're talking about a new kind of way of transferring money, etc. My idea is no. You're missing the whole point. This is like that's not the big idea at all. That's just the tiniest little proof of concept that we're going to apply to human governance generally and across the board, right? So this is just a drop in the ocean that we've seen so far. That's kind of where I'm at now.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely see that, and I think like I share similar understandings around that. Like, the Bitcoin is like the app or the proof of concept that runs on top of it. Similar to DeFi, and it's just a monetary policy,
right?
Whereas the actual, decentralized ledger, the consensus, the actual network that's being run, extrajudicially, is where the real innovation is.
Right.
And you can deploy any policy or any institution on top of that.
Right.
So like in my view, I guess, like I view it as a voluntarist social order, or a legalistic order, in which, I wouldn't necessarily go as far as to say is coder's law, because that's quite taboo these days. But, there's the potential for that to arise on such an order.
So let's unpack that code as law business. So when you say that, you're thinking about the Lawrence Lessig stuff?
Yes, that, and I think Lessig's sort of phrasing got adopted early on in the Ethereum community, for example, right? But then through the DAO hack, I think there was a little bit of humility that came in amongst the community as they had to negotiate, a surgical hard fork or a soft fork, I guess.
All right. Let's talk about the DAO hack, because there might be listeners that don't know what the DAO hack is or was, but you lived through the DAO hack. You saw it.
Sure.
So let me just start with my understanding of it, and then you can tell me where I've got it wrong. So first of all, let's start with the DAO, which is a decentralized autonomous organization, or is that how you would put it?
Yeah.
So basically, one of the things that we get out of crypto and crypto anarchy is the idea that you can have organizations that are not built top down like traditional corporations are, but they're completely decentralized. They might be autonomous, that is, they just live on the blockchain. So we could take certain smart contracts that execute contracts online. They're on the blockchain. Actually, maybe we should start there. I don't know what the level, this is a parenthetical remark, Al. I don't know what the level of audience is that we're aiming at here. How much?
I think it'll be people.
What level?
I think it'll be already crypto converts.
All crypto converts. Yeah. So we assume knowledge of smart contracts.
I think so. I mean, we can briefly touch upon it if there's a unique perspective on that. But yeah.
Okay. All right. So let's take the original DAO and let's see if I've got this right. So we have this distributed autonomous organization, and you can think of a DAO. It might be organized around smart contracts on the blockchain. I guess the interesting thing about this first DAO, named the DAO, was that it was going to have a kind of decentralized structure that would be involved with certain investments, right, on new protocols on the blockchain. And then someone hacked it and siphoned off a bunch of money. And then I guess the reason it became controversial is because Vitalik and others sat down and they decided, well, we need to do a reset here, because it's supposed to be code as law. And so, but yet somebody found a flaw in the code, but we're not going to let them get away with that because there's some deeper principle, I guess. And so he did a rollback with, i.e., a hard fork of the Ethereum protocol. Right? Is that?
Yeah. I mean, that's more or less it. I mean, yeah, the DAO was effectively, trying to make this sort of, I guess, anarchical, venture capital fund that could also be self-replicating into different ventures, right?
Yeah.
But there was this sort of splitting function which partitioned, funds, and there was an exploit in the smart contract code that allowed for funds to be drained, right? And so this really brings into the question this notion of coder's law, because it now is well, the code was written and deployed as intended, right?
Yeah.
And so at the same time, a lot of people who weren't, part of this sort of aristocracy, or, people who couldn't read Solidity at the time, used, heuristics to kind of to trust, people like Vitalik and other prominent leaders in the space that this was a vehicle worth putting your assets into.
Right.
And then we didn't have like the same developer tooling that we do have now. So like, we have formal verification like that, comes from specifications.
Yeah.
Solidity is a lot better now, these sort of things. But it's very like, it's kind of like deploying, code for a nuclear reactor in many ways, because there is this sort of myth that, blockchains are immutable. And ideally they are, and like they certainly are very difficult to change the history of. Anyway, it did end up with, the leadership of the Ethereum Foundation coordinating with miners and with exchanges to mitigate the fallout from this.
Right.
And part of that was from pressure from, perceived pressure from the SEC, right? Like the entire Ethereum project could have, failed, or at least the fear of it failing, due to mismanagement of funds and loss of consumer protection, I guess. So
I see. In your view, could that happen today? Could you?
Yeah, definitely.
Oh, do you think it could? You think there could be another hard fork of Ethereum or something if there was some catastrophic?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I think like it's part of. So I had like a huge reconfiguration of mind or disillusionment at this point, right? I think up until then I was purely a technologist, and I viewed these things as being like illegal systems that are just technology and didn't have a social component to them. And so I believed in this, idea of immutability, and modifying the chain was, effectively sacrilegious.
Yeah.
And like this is an idea that is held in Bitcoin to a large extent.
Yeah.
This sort of ideology of modifying the chain. Yet, if you want to write a Bitcoin node or a Bitcoin client and synchronize from scratch, you have to emulate all of the bugs that were in the client at certain, between certain block times or block numbers.
Yeah.
Right. So you have to emulate the bugs throughout history just so you can get to the point of the current state as intended. So, one of the ways you can do that is obviously formal verification, like improve, like, or reduce the risks of that happening. Another way, like on the client side, is to write multiple clients at the same time under different implementations, different languages, right? So you have different implementations. That way, if a bug introduced by a programmer is done in one client, it may not exist in another client. It doesn't prevent you from specification failures, but yeah.
Let me circle back to this code is law business, because I think we hear that slogan all the time, and we heard it at the time of the hard fork and the DAO hack and so forth. And but code is law, you can't do this. But that just suggests that everyone who's saying code is law and repeating it as like some sort of mantra, they didn't actually read the book. Because if you read Lawrence Lessig's book, cleverly titled Code is Law, or whatever, it's like there's really four different components of it, right? And so as he points out, the real issue is that there's like some agent or something, and what's fundamentally controlling what that agent does and so forth. And so some things you pass laws for, some things you don't really need to pass laws for, because, for example, the laws of physics govern it, right? So we don't have laws that say don't steal skyscrapers, right? Because it's like you can't do it. No one can pick up a skyscraper and run off with it. And, we're not going to have laws that say we're not going to have speed limit laws that say don't go faster than the speed of light. And similarly, he had this notion that it's not just, so you've got the physical laws, as it were, controlling things, and you also have social norms that control certain things. So there's certain kinds of laws that we don't bother passing simply because we count on religious or ethical norms to govern what people do there. And so the idea of, what part of this is actually law that's governing behavior is somewhat limited to begin with. And then when you get into the code as law part of it, that's really my take on it, or my understanding of it, is that the part of it that you're coding up, whether it's in the blockchain or whatever, is just part of the equation, right? and so I know you've thought a lot about this, but it's sort of like, the code in isolation is basically meaningless because any technology assumes that there's certain kind of human values that go along with it. It has to mesh with certain kinds of human values. So any kind of code you write, that if it's going to be successful, and this is true of the basic Bitcoin protocol, right? That is, Satoshi's code only works if you have the right mindset among the miners and the devs, right? Is if they don't have the right mindset, that can go to hell in a hurry, right? I mean, um, and I think that's an important point that people miss in this whole code is law thing, which is that no, there is a kind of ethical component to this as well, or a set of values that you have to have that accompany the code itself in order for this to actually work.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's kind of why I view it as an order rather than law, right? So, like, I think on the code as law, like, you can import law or like common law or tort law on chain by like writing the smart contract institution that represents some kind of court system, right? But it may follow rules that are very similar to or familiar to what we already have today. Whereas the policies that get written into the client and is shared amongst all the people securing the network, all the nodes securing the network, that is kind of the legalistic aspect that maintains the order. But at the end of the day, all of this technology is effectively, as you said, like an expression of these values or the political formula of the creators, right?
Yeah.
So Bitcoin has a libertarian political formula,
Yeah.
and like as long as it's upheld by everyone participating in the network in that community, that should endure with the chain, and it will lose its legitimacy if that political formula is violated, if according to the users who are participating in that network.
Right.
Similarly, I think Ethereum has evolved over time and probably has more of a modern liberal political formula that underpins it.
Yeah.
And then that seeks its expression through the technology itself.
Right. So, for example, we talk about, everyone talks about Bitcoin as though it's this completely immutable thing, and there's going to be 21 million Bitcoin and never more, never. But, if we brainwashed the miners and the devs and sort of like say we got them brainwashed into Keynesian economics or modern monetary theory or something like that, we could brainwash them into sort of inflating Bitcoin, right? I mean, they could be cranking out 40 million Bitcoin if we brainwash them into doing it. There's nothing in the technology itself that prevents that from happening.
No, and I don't think you can prevent that from happening, right? You can do slashing conditions based on staking, but it all has to happen within the protocol. Like, and it kind of reminds me of some of the political realists like Carl Schmitt. He has a terrible reputation.
Yes, he does.
But he does have an interesting idea around the exception. And his perspective is that you shouldn't really judge a state by its norms or like how it's functioning in peace times, but rather who has the decision-making capacity in times of crisis, right? And and so in a nation state or in historical states, that would be whoever's the sovereign, right? This would be either an elite or a king or the oligarchy or something like this. Whereas in public blockchains, I think that it exists, but the power is a bit more diffuse, right? Because anyone can run this node and start participating in the security of the network. There are power laws around that, depending on how many, like in proof of work, how many miners you have, like mining cards you have, or in proof of stake, how much capital you're putting up, depending on how the protocol is structured. But then there's also the developers and the distributed systems researchers and the leadership around organizing those, which is external to the chain. external to the order, that can change their perspectives on these things. The issue, though, is that power also has limits, based on this notion of this political formula, right? Like, if everybody's using Bitcoin for the purposes of, like, say, libertarian ideals, and now it starts to violate those in some way, it loses the people who are running that network start to lose the legitimacy, right? And you'll experience some kind of hard fork, which I see as an ideological riff, and then there'll be two new paths of history around. And this kind of happened at the DAO fork with Ethereum Classic. There were people who didn't read the book and still think code is law, and they're still on proof of work, and they're keeping everything as God intended, right? Like, the political theology.
It's still there. Ethereum Classic is still there. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going relatively quite strong.
Okay, so let me ask you a question. So when things go to shit, basically, that's when you find out what the real structure of things are.
Yeah.
If things go to shit with Ethereum, if there was some big crisis today, what happens? People call up Vitalik and a handful of other people. Is that what happens? By the way, you were actually right smack in the middle of all this, because Status broke Ethereum, right? And so,
correct.
Okay.
Well, we didn't break Ethereum, but the people participating in the donation or ICO, I guess we're allowed to say now, did. So I mean, in 2017, we were lucky to be a beneficiary of a token sale or raise for Status. And at the time, a lot of we were still experimenting with ways of, raising after the fallout of the DAO to build out all the public infrastructure that's necessary to continue these projects, right? Like Ethereum at writ large. And there were issues in terms of how previous ICOs at the time were functioning, because you could, a large player could get the majority of their share just by having a very large transaction fee and paying that towards the miners. There were also miners themselves that were injecting their own transactions and prioritizing them, irrespective of the actual protocol design, which has kind of evolved into MEV these days, right? So we were trying to, we were working with Jordi Bellina to try and figure out how to make this more fair, because we wanted to have a token distribution amongst actual users and not just, large stakeholders, which would also create issues for, governance, the DAO governance in the future if we had like large stakeholders in the protocol.
Okay.
And so we had these ceilings, which basically limited the amount that you could enter into a transaction at any point, and it would refund the rest back to the user.
Okay.
Unfortunately,
basically, you're setting a limit on per wallet how much status I can acquire.
Yes.
Okay.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah. So nobody, like, we did a commit reveal scheme, so nobody could know the curves that we're using to understand what this was, because we were limiting it initially, and then we were allowing it to be larger up to a certain fill size, and then we were resetting the curve. But what this ended up doing was, at first, it clogged the entire chain, because nobody paid attention to all of these transactions were getting rejected, right? There were we also limited the amount of gas you could send in a transaction. So if you sent more gas, it would reject the transaction entirely, right? So the first wave where the mempool got completely filled. At the time, Geth had an incredibly small mempool, so just transactions would get lost from the network entirely.
Okay.
And and eventually, like, it took, long story short, it probably took about a day or two for the mempool to get fully cleared. And the entire time, the Ethereum network was effectively denial of service attack. So nobody else could run this much.
So there are all these proposed transactions or attempted transactions that are just sitting there waiting for nodes to pick them up, and they were all attempts to buy status. Is that the idea?
Correct.
And then, so then what happened? So is it true that Vitalik actually contacted you guys directly?
Yes, he contacted Geordie. Yeah, and a few other prominent members were just like, they woke up and like, what the F was going on?
And what did he want you to do? Did he tell you to just stop, or what did he?
Well, no, we couldn't do anything, right? Like it was like once it's deployed, and like everything was happening, so we just had to write it out at that point.
Okay, so code in that case, code was law. So you just God himself contacted you, and you said, "There's nothing I can do about it." Yeah. But then, on the other hand, there was nothing he could do about it either, right?
Correct. Yeah, I mean, not really. Like, I mean, at that point, you're dealing with participants in the network trying to make transactions,
right?
And it's a limit of the actual network's ability to process transactions,
right?
Bandwidth capacity,
right?
And like people talk about transactions per second a day, because of things like this, right?
Right. Okay. But so I mean, that's the case where it looks like code is law, right? Because it's not like a traditional thing where like you're doing something and like the chief calls you up and says, "Shut it down now," because you're like, "I can't," and it's not like he could shut it down. This was just going to go forward, and you're just going to have to fix the network eventually.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's an economic component to this as well.
Yeah.
So, like, in the case of the DAO hack, you could talk to like miners to, try and exclude certain transactions. I mean, that's kind of what happened in the Tornado Cash incident, where, members securing the network were effectively censoring relays of blocks.
Yeah, right.
So they were doing it by volition. But in this case, like, you're basically going to a miner and saying, "Hey, don't make money, like stop making money, because this is using up the network." But it's kind of a function of the network's design, right? Like, it's a service network. You effectively pay taxes in the form of, for services rendered by the network. In this case, it's processing transactions through the EVM, and everything's working intended. And so, like, what can you do? I think miners would have been happy if there was a free market around the transaction cost, the total gas being able to be dumped into that, so they could earn more money and prioritize the transaction. And there was also money that was for miners. There was money left off the table because, as I said, like even though there was floating transactions in the network, they eventually disappear because the capacity for each node in their mempool was ridiculously small. So like you could only hold like a handful of transactions in your memory of your node at any point.
I think Al is going to kill us if we don't get to network states and Balaji and so forth.
No, absolutely. This is a fascinating conversation to witness, and definitely some really interesting takes for me as well. So thank you so much, both. And it's the easiest moderating job I've ever had, by the way. Yeah, I do have like two small questions about the earlier part of the conversation, about the book and Jarrad's journey, but also yourself, Peter. If you don't mind me, I'll ask those first before we go into network states. So, Jarrad, you've spoken a few times about the impact of Peter's book on your development. And, you're a successful technologist and entrepreneur who over the past few years have dedicated your personal resources to a project which is about securing civil liberties. I just wanted for you to tell us a bit more about the impact. We know that you've told us about the impact, but just wanted in your own words to hear a bit more about how that book fundamentally shaped your views.
Sure. I mean, I guess like firstly, it helped calcify some things that I already started observing in the net, right? Like governance structures materializing that didn't really exist in the real world, but existed in cyberspace. And then like you could see very clearly that there was like notions of territory in cyberspace. And like, Peter's collection and the subsequent work was really helped calcify, or at least give me show that this was something real and not just like a figment of my imagination. There were other people out there that were thinking this way, right? And Barlow's Declaration of Independence of Cyberspace was it I don't know, warmed the heart or something like that. It spoke to the soul in some way. And I think the other side of that is like most cypherpunks are like reformist in some sort of way, right? And so the attempts of Cyberstates or even Hashcash or like electronic money, such as Bitcoin, were more in the line of thinking that was more appealing to me. It was kind of like, okay, well, we can actually codify everything, right? And it wouldn't be too much later, like in my sort of 20s, that this started to calcify even more and understand, a bit more about how political systems work, like what states are or are not, and recognizing that you could probably achieve a lot of efficiencies in governance and unlock a lot of value for mankind by treating it like software. And I mentioned this notion of a political formula, and I don't think that I've fully built that yet, but I think that you can actually use this technology to create a political formula that is in line with liberalism, but holding liberalism more accountable to its own ideals in certain aspects, such as consent of the governed or we the people, and also mitigate, things such as spreading governmental immunity. And I can keep going on that sort of side, but and then Peter and I are working on a new book, and that's been very stimulating in terms of having to work with Peter and jam on certain ideas and help develop them out even further.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Now, Peter, can I ask you a bit of a personal question, or a question from me? Is that, what are your personal reflections when you look back, or when you look at people like Jarrad? Because through your work, you've inspired many generations. You've inspired a lot of people. What are your personal reflections when you look back, or when you come into contact with people like Jarrad? I know, obviously, as Jarrad mentioned, you two are co-authoring a book and working on the book together. But you must have had some personal reflections on all of these people who have been inspired by your work.
Well, it's not like you think, oh, there was this stuff I did way back when, and isn't it rewarding that people are discovering it and all that? Because it's sort of more like I wrote it this week. I understand it's whatever it was, 20 some years ago, more than 20 years ago, but it seems like it was yesterday, and I feel like Jarrad read it in draft, and we're still working on the ideas. So it doesn't feel. In philosophy, this happens a lot because the scope of things and uptake is sometimes it's centuries before people find your ideas. And as a general rule of thumb, I find that if I write something in philosophy, it's at least 10 years before people find it and start engaging with me on it. So to me, it's completely normal in this case that 20 years later, somebody is contacting me and saying, let's talk about it. So it just feels like a conversation that's happening right now, and that it's 10 minutes old. I mean, that's how it feels to me.
Yeah, I mean, I think the ideas are still pretty new and underdeveloped in many ways.
Yeah,
right?
the core, it's astounding how well it held up. I mean, considering when it came out, it was before there were even, as I wrote it, graphical web browsers were being developed, right? So in the original draft, it was, I was talking about Mosaic, and then I had to change it to Netscape, and now even Netscape's gone. But none of that really matters because the kind of core fundamental principles are the same, right? So when the technology comes and goes, but that's kind of superficial stuff. And the core issues, the core fundamental issues don't seem to change that much.
One of those things I've always sort of was a bit of a occupation of mine as I think about diverse group of cyberstates or network estates or decentralized communities is about the cohesive ecosystem that they're going to live in. How do they collaborate? And I know this is something that Jarrad have thought about in the past. We've discussed it. But basically, are we going to sort of create a quasi-United Nation or something like the United Nation that fosters collaboration between all of these cyber states and all of these decentralized communities? Or actually, we need to think afresh and it needs to be something else?
I mean, I certainly think there's going to be an internet of change, right? Which then implies that there's an internet of or a network of communities. I mean, the other thing here is that the amount of cyber states you subscribe to will be dependent on how you view your own self-identity, right? Like you can, in a similar way that you might have dual citizenship with nation states, you could have poly-citizenship with multiple cyber states potentially, right? I'm not a huge advocate for layer twos. I think that I have a point here, but I'm not an advocate for layer twos because they're effectively the worst of both worlds. From a network state or cyber state perspective, they're effectively a vassal state that's paying for security to an empire chain, or and at the same time, at least in current designs, they are centralized, so they are beholden to the jurisdiction in which the node is operating in, and they are explicitly performing the transactional, the value transfer, which makes them subject to KYC and AML once regulators catch up to that. Ultimately, they'll turn into layer ones, or at least have their own consensus. But that aside, what I do think they get right, and I think Alvaro also talks about, who leads Nomos, also talks about this. He says everything is bridged. And the thing that they get right is in the exit clauses for how value, if the layer 2 misbehaves, how you can recover the value on Ethereum, because it effectively doesn't leave the Ethereum network, right? It only has a virtual representation on the layer 2. So in the event where you might have multiple cyber states and you're worried about exit from a new cyber state that you trust less, but your value is still over in another one that you trust more, you'll still be able to have that exit possibility. Now, if that fails, then you're kind of screwed, right? But so there is definitely going to be a lot of there's a lot of ways that things can go wrong, but at least the potentiality for it to go right exists.
So
which it doesn't go right.
That's very cool, because so basically that could solve part of the exit problem that we were talking about. Can you take your resources with you? If you think about the resources in state S, I'm in a state S, and I've got so many resources that I've saved up over my life, and then I need to exit. And then your point is, well, sure, but the state is kind of a layer 2, and the real value is still, it's in Bitcoin or Ethereum or something like that. So when you exit the state, you can claim the true value.
Yeah, I would get rid of the layer 2 from that sentence and just say bridging between the way that different chains communicate to each other, but it enables that property. Yeah.
Okay. I have a take on this question too, which is about how conflicts get resolved between virtual communities, not virtual communities, but blockchain communities or cyber states or whatever the case might be. And the take is this, that blockchain communities are going to facilitate a lot of things. And one of the things they're going to facilitate is conflict resolution. So right now, the way things are structured, we run to mommy and daddy, to the UN or some centralized authority when there's a conflict between two states. But the way I envision it is that the minute you sit down and start negotiating community to community or state to state, the way you're going to do this is by creating a kind of blockchain community in which you are going to carry on this negotiation. So even if you're in negotiations with your worst enemy, right, those two parties are creating a kind of community. And if we avail ourselves of blockchain community in order to do this, then we can actually facilitate the process of negotiating between parties in conflict in a way that traditional means of negotiating and resolving conflict are not successful. I'm a big believer in this. And it's sort of a theory about disputes in general. And sort of where I really got into this idea was reading up about what's called relational contract theory. And it's something that's just as basic as a contract. Company A engages in a contract with company B, and you think, well, the way it works is the contract says, I give you this, you give me that. But with contracts between large corporations, there are always disputes over time, over the interpretation of the contract or so forth. And so there's this version of contract theory in which, well, no, it's not just this document and I say this and you say that, but we are actually creating a relationship between us in which we are going to foster communication between each other and make very explicit what our goals are going to be and articulate those goals and make them available to each other so we understand what each party to the dispute is interested in. And I read that and I said, this is what blockchains were invented for, right? Because here you have a shared set of documents, shared archives, shared information. You have a mode in which you can carry on discourse with each other about what your interpretation of the document is, in which you can articulate your interests, et cetera, et cetera. So I am sort of super optimistic about the future of conflict resolution at every level, not just state versus state, but also when two corporations get into a conflict or just engage in a contractual relationship with each other. You are building a little community with someone in the minute you enter into a contract with that individual. So whether you're engaged in a contractual relationship with another company, you're creating a little kind of blockchain community. If it's state to state, to resolve some sort of conflict or trade dispute or whatever, we're not going to run to sort of international organizations to resolve the dispute. I mean, we're going to create a little blockchain community for purposes of conflict resolution. Maybe outside parties will be part of that. But to me, this is one of the most interesting aspects of the whole thing. The idea of rethinking the whole nature of conflict resolution and how community creation and blockchain communities are going to be a part of that.
Yeah, I mean, and this idea is something we're trying to express in Nomos in two places. I talked about bridging, right? There's trusted bridging protocols, which literally form a network of nodes and kind of create a quasi chain between them that helps facilitate, the value transfer or data transfer between two branches of the network or two chains. But then, we also view communities starting off as smart contracts, but as the relationship or the amount of participants grows, they can effectively turn into an execution zone and act as their own network, and even go so far as to secede from the rest of the network and act independently if there's enough value to secure their own version of consensus. So yeah, all of these ideas we're talking about, we're trying to encode into Logos and Nomos in particular. Yeah.
So one last question, gents. At the top of the episode, Peter mentioned that he's optimistic. Now, I wanted to ask both of you, what is it when it comes to cyberstate and network state that makes you optimistic about the future? What elements, what aspects of it?
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
Okay. So, to me, it's that for the first time, we have an understanding of how people can be decentralized, or how organizations can be decentralized yet cooperative. And so the traditional way of thinking about things is, anarchy is such a great idea, but then everything goes to shit because there's nothing organizing anything and it's just chaos, right? Anarchy in the sense of headless. And with the development of decentralized systems, a lot of this sort of predates Satoshi a little bit, but Satoshi is sort of the clearest instantiation of it. We, for the first time in human history, have a very clear understanding of how it is that we can be organized in a way that is decentralized, yet still cooperative. And that's like a fantastic invention. I mean, to me, Jarrad hates it when I when I get really hyped up and start saying things like this, but but I don't care. To me, it's a revolutionary invention on the level of writing, right? On the level of the invention of democratic voting, right? It is on that level. So it's difficult to not be optimistic when you think about it in those terms. Obviously, optimism doesn't mean utopian. It just means that, it's not like, I once had a friend who said he was an optimist, but not like a traditional optimist. That is, so you said the pessimist says the glass is half empty, and the optimist says the glass is half full. This guy said, well, I think that the glass is 2/3 full. And I think that's kind of my take on this. It's not like utopia, but it's better than the glass is half full. I would say the glass is 2/3 full.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great answer. I don't hate it. It's just, I guess, and we need people like that, right? Yeah. I'm naturally not pessimistic, but I guess more realistic. And I've been working on the code and like building this sort of infrastructure and protocols, and got involved in Bitcoin like 2010. So you kind of don't want to see how the sausage is made, in like there's a lot of like historical there and that sort of thing. But reports like the World Bank and like seeing what this technology could potentially allow, in terms of like governance capacity for the planet, and just efficiency in general. When you step back and like sit there and take the time to ponder like what could be, it is enormous. Like it is a revolutionary idea that whose time is coming and will come. It's becoming practical to implement these things now. So I just want to keep my head down and working on it, and then like look up again, and it'll be there.
Yeah.
And I guess the other aspect of this that I find optimism through pessimism is that many people in crypto have had a lot of issues with their bank accounts, including myself, right? And you very, like, if you spend time with this, you can see very clearly how the regime or current policies in traditional banks are being anti-competitive and are deliberately taking away your money. It's still yours hypothetically, but it's not. They're the custodians of it.
Yeah.
And even if like it stays as cryptocurrencies, if a cryptocurrency becomes ubiquitous and globally accessible, then you'll actually have more ownership over your own value. You'll have stronger property rights, and like for me, that's like fundamental for societies. And I would love to see that future, if not for us, for our children.
Here's my final question. So the glass is what percentage full for you?
Am I drinking the Kool-Aid or am I pouring it?
It's like I guess it's Kool-Aid. Yeah. So you have to. It's Kool-Aid. It's how full is the glass of Kool-Aid?
I guess like. Can I give a Schrodinger's answer? Like, it really depends on like if this technology is allowed to come to fruition, or where it comes into fruition and what time scale, right? So I think like the glass is full on a long enough timeline because the cat's out of the bag already.
Yeah.
Whether it's going to manifest itself in the next 2 decades is completely
determined by us.
Yeah,
depends
on us. Yeah.
Gents, this has been a fascinating conversation. Thank you both so much. Thank you so much to Peter for waking up really, really early, and of course for accepting our invitation to come on to the Logos Estate podcast. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks for having me, guys.
Thank you, Peter.